Hi everyone, I'm Jack Rambling Raconteur and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Ubik by Philip K. Dick. Fantastic book from 1969. Really Philip K. Dick's strongest novel in my reading. It is the book where he fuses the best elements in his writing and just crafts it into this incredibly compelling narrative. Ubik can be read in like a single weekend or one or two nights because it is such a quick and mesmerizing narrative to dip into it. There's this quest to it. It's a detective story wrapped up within speculative fiction, and yet it's so much more than that. It is a book that is fantastic to read the first time, and yet is very rewarding to reread and closely read. There are tiny little anecdotes and drops and hints throughout the book about what is going on, about the larger ideas that Dick is trying to push towards and probe at and explore. And so it's a very fun book to read, but it's an equally fascinating and interesting book to just dig into and examine on a deeper level. And so there's so much I enjoy about this book. I reread it this year, and the things I noticed this time, I loved rereading this book. There are elements that are science fiction, but as with Philip K. Dick's best books, he's also getting at this spirituality and questing around this. He dips into these fascinating moments of historical fiction, really, at times. And his social satire, the way he is commenting all of that, really comes together and becomes just brilliant. So I do want to get into the book, talk about it, read some passages. This is going to be filled with spoilers. So if you've never read it, just please go take the time to read these 200 pages and be left with many questions that will make you want to go back and reread the book. But let's just dive in. So we are set in 1992. So it's about a generation in the future from when Dick was writing the novel. And we're introduced to a couple of characters right off the bat. We're introduced to a concept that people, as they're dying, can be frozen, sort of cryogenically frozen, but they can be revived temporarily for a couple of conversations. And there's sort of these, business questions around it, these ethical questions around it. It's clearly only for the wealthy. And so we're introduced to Glenn Runsiter, who is going there, and he has some questions for his wife. And we learn that what the half-life process does, that you can't perpetually preserve someone. It's not eternal life. But it basically, if you have an hour or two left with that person, you can take it in installments, is really what Philip K. Dick's getting at within it. But we're also ultimately then introduced to these folks who work for Runsiter. And it becomes, I don't think, coincidental that there's Joe Chip and 11 others. And so we sort of have these 12 apostles for Runsiter. And Joe Chip is sort of our main character, the experiences he has. And Dick gives us this world, this world of emerging and developing and fascinating new technologies that are also fundamentally dehumanizing. And there's a real humor to that. And so I just want to dip in to examine sort of how comical and ridiculous this world is at the start. He rang off, then searched in the cupboards, this is Joe Chip, of the kitchen for a broom, a manual or self-powered or vacuum cleaner, helium battery, or wall socket. Neither could be found. Evidently, he had never been issued any sort of cleaning equipment by the building's supply agency. Hell of a time, he thought, to find that out. And he had lived here 4 years. Picking up the vid phone, he dialed 214, the extension for the maintenance circuit of the building. Listen, he said, when the homeostatic entity answered, I'm now in a position to divert some of my funds in the direction of settling my bill vis-a-vis your cleanup robots. I'd like them up here right now to go over my app. I'll pay the full and entire bill when they're finished. Sir, you'll pay your full and entire bill before they start. By now, he had his billfold in hand. From it, he dumped his supply of magic credit keys, most of which by now had been voided, probably in perpetuity, his relationship with money and the payment of pressing debts being such as it was. I'll charge my overdue bill against my triangular magic key, he informed his nebulous antagonist. That will transfer the obligation out of your jurisdiction. On your books, it'll show as total restitution, plus fines, plus penalties. I'll charge those against my heart-shaped Mr. Chip. The Ferris and Brockman Retail Credit Auditing and Analysis Agency has published a special flyer on you. Our receipt slot received it yesterday and it remains fresh in our minds. Since July, you've dropped from a triple G status credit-wise to quadruple G. Our department, in fact, this entire Connaught building is now programmed against an extension of services and or credit to such pathetic anomalies as yourself, sir. Regarding you, everything must hereafter be handled on a basic cash subfloor. In fact, You'll probably be on a basic cash subfloor for the rest of your life. In fact, he hung up and abandoned the hope of enticing and or threatening the cleanup robots into entering his muddled out. Instead, he padded into the bedroom to dress. He could do that without assistance. After he had dressed in a sporty maroon wrapper, twinkle-toed turnip shoes, and a felt cap with a tassel, he poked about hopefully in the kitchen for some manifestation of coffee. None. He then focused on the living room and found by the door leading to the bathroom last night's great cape, every spotty blue yard of it, and a plastic bag which contained a half-pound can of authentic Kenya coffee. A great treat, and one which only while pizzled would he have risen to, especially in view of his current abominable financial situation. Back in the kitchen, he fished in his various pockets for a dime and with it started up the coffee pot. Sniffing the, to him, very unusual smell, he again consulted his watch, saw that 15 minutes had passed. He therefore vigorously strode to the apt door, turned the knob, and pulled on the release bolt. The door refused to open. It said, 5 cents, please. He searched his pockets. No more coins, nothing. I'll pay you tomorrow, he told the door. Again, he tried the knob. Again, it remained locked tight. What I pay you, he informed it, is in the nature of a gratuity. I don't have to pay you. I think otherwise, the door said. Look in the purchase contract you signed when you bought this Connaught. In his desk drawer, he found the contract. Since signing it, he had found it necessary to refer to the document many times. Sure enough, payment to his door for opening and shutting constituted a mandatory fee. Not a tip. You discover I'm right, the door said. It sounded smug. From the drawer beside the sink, Joe Chip got a stainless steel knife. With it, he began systematically to unscrew the bolt assembly of his app's money-gulping door. I'll sue you, the door said as the first screw fell out. Joe Chip said, I've never been sued by a door, but I guess I can live through it. And so we're introduced right away to this world, this emerging world of fascinating technologies that are constantly, literally nickel and diming Joe Chip in his existence. You're not paying monthly electricity, you're not paying the doorman or anything. It is constantly these nickel and dimes that you have to get through. It's an absolute send-up of the consumer culture of the 1950s and 1960s that Dick had observed, but it's a send-up of the idea that the machines and the robots are going to somehow make life easier at a cost, in this case, literal. And so the different interactions that occur within the 1992 future that Dick has created are very funny at times. They're also dehumanizing, and we see this world and these cool little interesting things, but even the concept of the half-life, the person who can be brought back and sort of, taking installments on someone's final hours is brutal. One is almost held as a hostage to this life, if that's all there is, or if there's something beyond that. One is held as a hostage to this. And so Dick is really getting at all these ideas, but he's wrapping it up in this, humor, but also in this compelling story of there's a corporate conspiracy, and there are these different telepaths and precogs who have all these different abilities that they blend together to make this team, and they're sort of like the science fiction Dirty Dozen that are going to go together, and they're going to go to the moon and like swing this corporate strategy, and then all hell breaks loose. And gradually, Dick starts to turn this speculative fiction and this detective story into what is Ubik? What has happened? Was there an assassination attempt? Who's the traitor within the group? And he takes all of those and he's unraveling this. But behind it all, there's clearly some larger idea he's getting at. And there are some really fascinating twists, which I won't spoil all of them, although I've encouraged anyone watching this to go read it. But I wanted to have another little passage that gets at this idea of where the book starts to become, rather than satire, more of a horror story, and that we start to see that things are not as they appeared. There's time is slipping in a sense. And so they're back, and they get 5 cents, please, the door of the coffee shop said, remaining shut before him. That's Joe Chip. He waited until a couple passed by him on their way out. Neatly, he squeezed by the door, made it to a vacant stool, and seated himself. Hunched over, his hands locked together before him on the counter, he read the menu. Coffee, he said. Cream or sugar? The speaker of the shop's ruling monad turret asked. Both. The little window opened, a cup of coffee, 2 tiny paper-wrapped sacks of sugar, and a test tube-like container of cream slid forward and came to rest before him on the counter. 1 international postcred, please, the speaker said. Joe said, charge this to the account of Glenn Runsiter of Runsiter Associates, New York. Insert the proper credit card, the speaker said. They haven't let me carry around a credit card in 5 years, Joe said. I'm still paying off what I charged back in. One post-cred, please, the speaker said. It began to tick ominously. Or in 10 seconds, I will notify the police. We can do with, he passed the post-cred over. The ticking stopped. We can do without your kind, the speaker said. One of these days, Joe said wrathfully, people like me will rise up and overthrow you, and the end of tyranny by the homeostatic machine will have arrived. The day of human values and compassion and simple warmth will return, and when that happens, someone like myself who has gone through an ordeal and who genuinely needs hot coffee to pick him up and keep him functioning when he has to function will get the hot coffee, whether he happens to have a post-cred readily available or not. He lifted the miniature pitcher of cream, then set it down. And furthermore, your cream or milk or whatever it is sour. And so there's something going on. Sure, we have Joe having his moment against the machines, and Dick is kind of wanting us to be on Joe's side and to really question, is technology really going to help us out? Is nowadays, in 2025, is AI really going to help us out, or is there going to be some cost? We know there will be. What is it going to be? But beyond that, there's something layered in there, and it's the fact that that cream is sour. And they start to realize that other things are wrong in this reality. The cash seems to be different. The fashion has changed. The vehicles are changing. The technology is changing. And what they start to realize is they keep sliding backwards in time. And so through that, Dick is able to examine all sorts of ideas. This is the same guy who would write who'd written The Man in the High Castle with its whole alternate history. He would write other books that poke at these ideas, not just of what our future might look like as humans, but how our past could have been different, or what it might look like from this different perspective and point of view. And that's where he goes across the second half of the book as they slip farther and farther in time. One of the, in chapter 9, which is really almost this horror story contained within the book, we start to see that as time is slipping back and the milk is sour and decaying, some of the people are too. And their bodies seem to be just wasting away. Their very clothes seem to be decaying and turning back into old time. It's as if the clothes are becoming the threads from which they were drawn, and then the threads even back to this almost atomic structure from what they were as elements in the atoms, rather than as the fibers that are bound into clothing. And so there's this horror of decay. We get one chapter that in chapter 9 that really is from the point of view of one of the characters who's experiencing this decaying body, and his sensation of these visions of like the elevator. When the elevator seems to open up, it looks like it's an elevator from the early 1900s, even far beyond from when they've drifted back to. The planes become biplanes and older vehicles. The medicine becomes older and is in like those old brown bottles. And so all of those details allow Dick to fill in this world and to skip across the genres. The book is firmly this science fiction, speculative fiction story. It's also firmly a detective book. Joe Chip is not the brightest person. Glenn Runsiter, in the work he was doing and the glimpses we have of him, not necessarily brightest people, but they have this dogged private detective determination to them that makes them interesting and compelling characters. We're on their side in this quest, reprehensible and incompetent as they seem at times. But it's also this historical fiction book where Dick is doing those things. And fundamentally, we're getting at what on earth is Ubik? Because every chapter starts off with this statement about what Ubik is. The best way to ask for beer is to sing out Ubik. Made from select hops, choice water, slow-aged for perfect flavor, Ubik is the nation's #1 choice in beer. Made only in Cleveland. Another chapter begins, wild new Ubik salad dressing. Not Italian, not French, but an entirely new and different taste treat that's waking up the world. Wake up to Ubik and be wild. Safe when taken as directed. Throughout the book, we get these, but the ads themselves are changing. If money worries have you in the cellar, go visit the lady at Ubik Savings and Loan. She'll take the frets out of your debts. Suppose, for example, you borrow 59 post-creds on an interest-only loan. Let's see, that adds up to... And so we have these questions around Ubik, and it turns out that Ubik is this crucial thing that can perhaps slow that decay. And the way that Ubik exists, the form that it exists in, changes across the novel. And there's something, of course, about Ubik that it is ubiquitous. And it becomes very clear that Ubik, again, massive spoilers, Ubik becomes Dick's analogy and metaphor for God or some supreme being or higher being, whatever that could be. Throughout the book, there are explicit references and characters quote and reference the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But there's also these sort of Gnostic questings underneath it around what Ubik is, and that Ubik is somehow able to slow the physical decay and in a sense release the ideas around the physical flesh being, you know, broken and cursed and fallen, and the spiritual, like, inner part is what's important. And there's an idea around if the half-life is preserving that broken physical form in order to communicate with the spiritual side of the soul, is it trapping it? So there's all of these questions underneath it, but Dick is just skipping across those genres just effortlessly. A first-time reader might not notice any of that. It's just this fascinating gauntlet of a narrative, and yet taking the time to read it and pay attention to it, it just reveals fascinating things. A really good example of that is in the first 30 pages, where one character who's introduced as sort of this new emerging, you know, telepath, has this, and she says this about her abilities. She goes, "No," she shook her head, "I didn't really understand it either until your scout sat down with me in the kibbutz cafeteria and told me. Maybe it's true," she shrugged, "maybe not. He said you could show me objective proof of it with your testing battery." "How would you feel," he asked her, "if the test showed that you have it, this talent?" Reflecting, Pat said, "It seems so negative. I don't do anything. I don't move objects or turn stones into bread or give birth without impregnation or reverse the illness process in sick people." Those being explicit references to miracles referenced within the Christian New Testament. And although Jesus does not turn the stones into bread when tempted, that's something that's referenced there. The virgin birth, the reversing the illness process in sick people, and healing. Pat Conroy doesn't have those abilities. So Dick is laying in these tiny little details, as I mentioned earlier. The idea that there are these 12 apostles working for Glenn Runsiter at different times. The initials of Joe Chip and Jesus Christ. These are all layered in there for someone to catch and pick up on amid the fascinating adventure that unfolds across this. And the way that the book comes to its crescendo, the revelation about what has been going on, who the villain has been. It seems to be 3 different individuals across the book. And the ultimate revelation is worth the payoff. It's layered in. It works marvelously well. And it is just an absolutely fascinating book to read and to dip back into and be like, oh, he was setting this up for us. And he never answers quite what Ubik is. He's not necessarily interested in telling us who he thinks God is. But he wants us to think about these things while wrapped up in this fascinating story. So if you've never read it, I would encourage you to. It really is this marvelous book to spend time with. And it can be a great introduction to Philip K. Dick. But if you've tried Dick before and haven't enjoyed his novels, this might be one to go back to. And you know, if you didn't like it, of course, I'm not going to force you to reread it. But it's one I did enjoy rereading. And thinking of some other texts, certainly The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, sort of a contemporaneous novel, and a much shorter work than Gravity's Rainbow, but getting at similar ideas of like a world that seems wrapped up in conspiracy, contemporary rather than speculative, but a world that teems with conspiracy and satire and jokes. Much later on, The Broom of the System by David Foster Wallace, I think, has explicit homages to Ubik, not just within the idea of the Great Ohio Desert, this black hellscape, this man-made god that Wallace is getting at, but the corporate nature of it, the corporate satire within the book. Murakami's Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World, the way that this is getting at the consciousness of people and the subconscious, the intersections of those, and the revelation of how these 2 sort of stories within the novel connect with each other, I think is very close. And I will link my videos on all 3 of those in the description box if anyone's interested in them. Another contemporaneous writer, Kurt Vonnegut. And it was hard for me to nail down which Vonnegut novel felt closest to Ubik. And I'd be curious if others have an input on that. I haven't read all of Vonnegut's works. A Cat's Cradle doesn't feel particularly close. Maybe Breakfast of Champions, but I thought some of his stories get a little bit closer perhaps to what Dick was doing in Ubik. In terms of Dick's own work, I think probably the closest one is this Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. This is sort of like Ubik advanced almost. It's not as much of a detective novel and adventure novel. There's a lot going on that's very weird, very strange, very Eldritch across this book. This, as I said, is sort of if you enjoyed Ubik and you've never tried this one, go for it. And then later on we would have Valis, which gets into some very autobiographical elements of these experiences Dick had, these spiritual and mystical experiences he was having. And towards the end of his career, that's a direction he went. Other science fiction writers, C.L. Moore, her story, Vintage Season, one of the best, one to definitely read. But someone else who was able to probe ideas of irresponsible uses of technology within the future with just marvelous prose. The stories of Ray Bradbury, not so much his novels, but I think his stories and some of the ideas he was pushing towards come across there. The Michael Moorcock in the 60s and 70s, probably the Cornelius Chronicles is where he comes closest to sort of the zany nature of Philip K. Dick and the danger that can lurk within it, and this sense of a story that is in its time but is also pushing at speculative technologies and such. And the Cornelius Chronicles can be enjoyable. They're not as clear to read as Moorcock's more fantasy-driven books or steampunk books, but they folks who like Philip K. Dick might really enjoy that side of Michael Moorcock's enormous oeuvre. Don DeLillo, maybe with Players, the way he gets at sort of the danger there, the people discovering that there's more to the world than they had realized. I think there are elements of DeLillo that pop out as comparable to what Philip K. Dick is doing, but they're very different writers. Their styles are very different. Alastair Reynolds more recently with Revelation Space had some other ideas around people whose bodies are preserved in interesting ways, some wild cybernetic technologies. This is a really good science fiction novel for someone who wants something that's more recent. The stories of Robert Sheckley, I think, get towards where the direction Philip K. Dick was going. Some non-science fiction e-books. Certainly, as I said, the Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler, the Philip Marlowe Dogged Detective, I think characterizes Joe Chip in a certain number of ways, and the way he's trying to figure out what is going on around him. But others, we could be Kafka with The Trial or The Castle, this idea of the world is not what it seems. An everyman who does not understand what is happening to him is trying to figure it out, and unpleasant things are happening. Italo Calvino, perhaps it's the Cloven Viscount or the Non-Existent Knight. Perhaps it's something a little bit more postmodern, like If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, but I think he has some interesting ideas. From the 1950s, The Space Merchants. That's a really great corporate satire, oh my gosh, the world could become a very dangerous place. Another sort of time-slipping one would be Time's Arrow by Martin Amis. He wanted to do something totally different. I don't know that this book works entirely, but it is worth an attentive reading if you're interested. But I would say read the back of the book, maybe check out a summary on Goodreads before dipping into this, because it can, the way that where he pushes towards with that, he goes to a pretty dark place. And then certainly various Gnostic texts, I think pretty explicitly Philip K. Dick was referencing those. So let me know if you have a favorite novel by Philip K. Dick. I do think Ubik is probably his strongest, though I enjoy plenty of others, and I'll probably read another one later this year. So I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.